Welcome to Philosophique. Today we're speaking with Stephen Batchelor, who wrote The Art of Solitude, a book that explores how we can come to a place of comfort while being alone, a place of introspection and learning that we bring back to others after being in a state of solitude. He joins me today from France, where he lives, and he's a widely known Buddhist scholar and really bridged the gap between the religiosity of Buddhism and a secular belief in Buddhist principles. Once was a monk and hung up his robes at a certain point to explore the secular side of the learnings that he cultivated over a career that is expansive, and you can read more about his background on our website. But I'm happy to share this podcast with all of you. You can find the show notes at getphilosophique.com or Instagram at getphilosophique. And the podcast is available across Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you get your podcasts from. So I hope you enjoy. For our listeners who aren't familiar with your background, it would be great to hear a little bit about how you came to where you are today and a bit about how you came to write The Art of Solitude.
Well, I mean, to actually fully answer that question, to explain how I came to write this book would take probably more time than we have. So this is going to be a very a brief sort of summary. When I was 18 years old, I flunked out of high school, didn't therefore get the place at college that I had been given. And I used that year off to travel. And I went out to India with lots of young people at that time. And I ended up in Dharamsala, which is where the Dalai Lama and his Tibetan community lived. And I very quickly got drawn into the study of Buddhism. And not long after that, became a Buddhist, began to practice meditation, and actually effectively dedicated the rest of my life to trying to figure out what Buddhism is trying to tell us, and trying to understand it and interpret it in ways that could speak to, ordinary people in the world rather than religious scholars or monks or whoever. I think Buddhism has got a lot to offer us, but at the same time, it's couched in a language and it's got all kinds of views and ideas that are not terribly accessible to a lot of people. So all of my books, and I started my first book was published in 1983, called Alone with Others, and perhaps you already have an echo of The Art of Solitude in that book. And in some ways that was in my mind when I came to write The Art of Solitude. It was to go back to this, what I think of as very much the core dynamic within human life, is the dynamic between the relationship we have with ourselves in our own privacy, in our own thoughts, in our own feelings, on the one hand, and at the same time, the relationship we have with other people, in which we are interconnected with family, with friends, with students, with the wider society, and so forth and so on. And both of these dimensions of our humanity, as I understand Buddhism, are, as it were, equally crucial into becoming, a flourishing, fully, active person in the world. Alone with Others was published in 1983. I then published many, many books after that, the most famous of which is probably called Buddhism Without Beliefs, which is an attempt to sort of strip Buddhism of its overt religiosity and its cultural difference from that of the West, and to try to put into ordinary English what Buddhism is about. And I think most of my books have been trying to do something similar, albeit on different topics. So I started writing The Art of Solitude, I think, probably in about 2016, 2017. I can't remember exactly when. And this was a time in which I sought to reconsider everything that I'd done in my life up to that point. I turned, I think, 65 years old. I took a year sabbatical.
You mentioned the Korean tradition at 60 where
That's right,
people go out to the hills and act silly.
No, that's right. I was 60, that's right, not 65. And so it was a moment of recollecting myself in the literal sense of the word, really asking, okay, what have I done in my life? I've only got a relatively short time ahead of me now. Let's take stock of what has happened in my somewhat eccentric career trajectory, as you might say. And so I then, started thinking about solitude. I also, as the book shows quite clearly, I went on to a number of solitary retreats. I got involved in the life of Montaigne, the French philosopher. I even spent a part of a day in his tower
Yeah.
all by myself, and so forth and so on. I also explored plant medicines in the form of
Yeah.
ayahuasca, peyote, and that was also another way to try to sort of come back to those experiences I'd had as a younger person that had led me onto this Buddhist path. And one of them was psychedelics. I wanted to go back to that and look at it not so much, as a sort of a young hippie, but to do it in a ceremonial religious setting
A more
with
grounded way.
more grounded way.
Yeah.
Of course, meditation is part of it. That's been part of all of my work. And also art. To me, the practice of art, which is something I'm also personally very much involved in, has a lot to say about solitude. The artist in his or her studio, in
Mhm.
many ways, is very much alone and struggling to somehow articulate their artistic vision, whether you're a writer or a painter or poet, doesn't really matter. So I tried to weave these various main threads together: philosophy,
Mhm.
medicine, meditation, art, and to put together a short book that would try to bring the idea of solitude in the deeper sense of the word. I don't just mean being alone somewhere for a while. That's not solitude.
Yeah.
But really analyzing this idea in more depth. And
And I
curiously,
noticed, is that one of your collages behind you on the wall?
that one over there. Oh, yes, it is actually. Do you want to see it?
Yeah,
Get closer if you like. Hang on.
sure. I know that through the book you speak about the collages and
There you
some of them
are.
you've put together from found objects, right? Oh,
That's
it's
right.
awesome.
Now that, in fact, the
Hmm.
readers might be interested, that is, in fact, the Art of Solitude, literally.
Yeah.
There are 32 squares,
Uh-huh.
and there are 32 chapters in the book,
Oh,
and
wow.
this collage is organized by chance operations, determines the sequence of chapters in the book.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are 4 different colors: white, yellow, blue, red, which are the 4 primary
Wow.
Buddhism, and each one symbolizes one of the threads of the book: meditation, medicine, philosophy, and art.
Oh, super cool.
So that's the sequence in which these randomly organize. This is an image of the book, effectively.
Oh, wow. So it's the visual outline
It's a
before
visual
we
outline,
had the
and the book, which is here, is basically organized on the same principles as I make the art. It's the
Awesome.
first time I've done that. It's not entirely obvious in the book itself,
Yeah.
but that was my writing method.
That's very cool to see for me how you organize the book. But I wanted to start um, with actually a couple statistics about solitude and togetherness today that have been recently published. To start with the statistics part, which is one thing that the American Psychological Association does every so often is a survey around just the mental health of adults and how that is going in the particular time period. And so one thing that stuck out to me in the newest publication, which was this year, is that 60% of adults say that social divisions are a major source of stress.
Mm-hmm.
And more than half of them, report feeling isolated, left out, lacking companionship. And to me, it's sort of striking to a certain extent, but
Mm-hmm.
not at the same time. So I guess in the context of the art of solitude and, having the distinction between aloneness, isolation, solitude, and sort of that spectrum. Is that surprising to you, just in terms of how many people actually are feeling aloneness or isolation versus actually being able to access solitude in a more sequestered, alone
Yeah.
space? Any thoughts on that statistic?
I'm not too surprised by it. I mean, I would never have been able to second guess what the percentage was. But I do think we live in, and this is not exactly a new idea, but I do think we live in a very fragmented society. And I think also, we have the illusion of being very well connected, particularly through social media. Everyone's connecting with everyone all the time. It's going crazy. But I don't think that's actually probably having much impact at all on people's sense of feeling alone, feeling isolated. Because after all, I mean, what we found in COVID, what we find through all the things we now do online, to some extent because of COVID, like this, for example, in some senses is an indicator of our solitude, of our solitariness. We need nowadays to go less, and we don't need to go out with other people to work so much
Mhm.
anymore. We can do stuff online and so on. But I think the problem is that we're not actually educated or trained in modern Western society to actually come to terms with our solitude, particularly if, for example, you're no longer part of any religious movement. If you went to a church or you had some sort of religious background, that would often include moments in which of prayer, for example, or meditation or yoga, where you enter into a silence that others enter into too, and that you turn your attention away from your immediate to something that you value more deeply in your life. And that is not experienced as isolation and loneliness, even though the external circumstances are similar. The monk or the nun in her cell is likewise cut off from all sorts of people. They don't have any email and whatnot, but they're not lonely. So in other words, the external conditions in themselves are not going to make you necessarily lonely,
Mm.
or they're not going to necessarily make you say, hey, this is great. I like being by myself. I'm really into this.
It's more
Um,
what you do with that
it's what you do
state of
with it.
loneliness, I guess, right?
Yeah. It's about how do we actually learn to inhabit our own isolation. We are existentially alone. That is a given. I mean, many religious traditions will say that you're born alone and you die alone. In
Yeah,
other
it's so
words, you come
interesting.
into this world, it's just you. Of course, your mother and everyone was all there, but you're thrown into this place without really, having asked for it, as far as we know. And you've got to figure out how to, cope with this experience. And it can feel very isolating being human. And we treasure so many close connections because it makes us feel part of something else. But at the same time, we're also aware that, what I experience in my inner life is not going to be the same as my friends or my partner or my parents do. There's something going on in our existence that is ours and ours alone. And I think the contemplative traditions, or traditions that encourage you to create art or explore your deeper psychology, all of these traditions recognize there is a great value to solitude. That solitude is necessary to clear away all the chatter and the noise and the interruptions and the distractions, and learn certain skills as well to ground yourself in solitude. Ultimately, I understand solitude to be a metaphor for nirvana. Nirvana is the stopping of reactivity in a way.
Mhm.
It's finding that inner stillness and calm and clarity in being able to say without any hesitation, yes,
Yeah, and it's sort of like I'm
yeah,
okay in
okay.
this. Yeah.
I can cope with this. This is actually another way of being in the world. It can be deeply insightful if I turn my attention to explore some of the questions that most strongly animate me. And it's not lonely at all. And
So
yeah.
I was just gonna the second statistic is kind of dovetails with the first one.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And this one is from Elizabeth Dunn at the University of British Columbia. But
Uh-huh.
she looks at happiness ratings among different daily activities, and they can be really mundane things, or more exciting things like going out to eat, walking, running, or like doing the laundry, folding clothes, things
Mhm.
like that. And what she finds is that when you do any of these, for the most part, the happiness rating is higher when there's another person involved, even if it's
Uh,
folding the laundry or or something like that. So,
uh,
right, there's this idea that even the mundane can be improved by having connection with another person while in that process. So, just interested in how you think about the balance between, say, solitude and then connection and how all that rolls together. I think I have an idea, but it would be great to hear from your perspective.
Well, the fact is, we are social animals. Human beings are highly socialized animals. And so we flourish and in a sense, we do our best, and I think, through collaborative activities. And that's not just a question of feeling safe and survival and so on. That's probably part of it. But I think it enables us to digest and to come to terms with and understand what we're doing and to enjoy what we're doing. If we can exchange banter, or we can chit chat, or we can laugh together, or whatever, it just brings the experience much more into the fabric of being human. So yeah, I think we clearly need socialization. I mean, we need it. We are social beings. We don't need it. We have to have it. But at the same time, we're also, I would argue, we're also solitary beings. We're beings who are able to withdraw from society. The classic example is, of course, the monk or the Arctic explorer or the person who rows across the Atlantic or whatever. But nonetheless, that is also a part of ourselves that I would feel has to be given equal importance in terms of our flourishing to become a much more fully rounded or complete person. The social element is, of course, much easier in a way because, we can bounce all of our worries and anxieties off another person through conversation and through chit-chatting and so on. And so it's in a sense it's easier to do that than it is to sort of cut yourself off and go into a solitary retreat. And I spent many years, I've spent leading meditation retreats with groups of people. But one of the things that I constantly found is that there's a lot of people who come on these retreats who are drawn to the idea of solitude and not speaking for a week and just watching their breath, whatever it is. But when the rubber hits the road, as it were, when they actually find themselves, on a retreat, it's terrifying. They hate it. They're desperate, totally frustrated by the silence. They want to talk. But the point is, they don't want to talk about anything particularly profound. They just want to talk. They want to
just
connect.
Don't want to be alone or lonely, rather, maybe. Yeah.
So the big challenge in getting into the spirit of a meditation retreat is learning to. I mean, it's a bit basic, really, but it's learning to accept yourself for who you are. And I think a lot of our social activities are often ways of avoiding ourselves, in a way, of being able to just lose ourselves in a trivial conversation or watch some not particularly interesting show on the TV. It's far better than having silence.
It's sort of filler for time and space.
That's right. I think that's very characteristic of not just Western culture, modern Western culture. I think it's much the same wherever you go in the world, is that there is a fear of silence, a fear of solitude that I think is a failing in basically our fundamental education of being human.
Yeah, and I think that's a good transition into sort of the first section about Montaigne, right? And thinking about, well, first of all, I think a lot of our expectations socially, whether it be, to go to school, have a successful marriage relationship, have children, then become part of the caring community as older people, is all inherently extremely social, right? And sort of this idea of being in solitude, I think in maybe the popular imagination requires an extreme move as, transitioning to being a monk or being a hermit or an ascetic or whatever it is. When I think what you put forward is that it's really not necessary to do that in order to achieve some of the benefits of solitude. And at baseline, we should have some of that in order to be healthy, I guess, even socially or emotionally, right? So maybe just to start with Montaigne, which I actually read a lot more of him after reading your book. Um, it's your high level thoughts, I guess, for some people who aren't as familiar on his sort of escape from society or his move into solitude and then, itching to go back eventually. But your thoughts, high level, on why he's so important to solitude and understanding it.
Well, Montaigne is one of the first figures in Western culture who made a conscious decision to retreat to a tower on his estate, not far from where I'm living now. In fact, it's about a 40-minute drive away. It's a lovely castle, well, a mansion or manor house, let's say, in the Dordogne. Montaigne had led a very, very active life. He'd been the mayor of the city of Bordeaux, near here, and was very much involved in politics and law in some way. I can't remember exactly. He was also a diplomat. He was very much a connector, someone who was constantly, trying to arrange meetings between different figures within the wars of religion that were raging around him at the time. So he wasn't exactly a kind of an introvert by disposition, is what I'm trying to say. And, but he decided, largely through the influence of the recently recovered Greek and Latin writings of antiquity. This was the High Renaissance. This was the rebirth of the ancient Greek and Roman culture of antiquity, and it was now being rediscovered in libraries and monasteries all over Europe, and there was this great movement to try to bring that alive again. And Montaigne was actually brought up speaking Latin. He didn't speak French until he was about 7 years old. His first language was Latin. His father wanted him to be a Renaissance man. Montaigne was deeply immersed in particularly the philosophical writings of the Greek tradition, particularly the skeptics and the Stoics, the Epicureans, and these other people. His the person who was most influential was Socrates. And here he found a way of thinking that was not Christian, although Montaigne was a very devout Christian, but this was a non-Christian humanistic methodology of thinking through certain ideas, but also the Greek philosophers didn't see philosophy just as an academic exercise that you do in a university course. Yeah. They saw it as a way of life. And so they actually trained themselves to embody the values of their philosophies that they were practicing. And part of that for Montaigne was really coming to terms with your own mind, with your own self, with your own mortality, with your own existence. And he went into this long period of relative isolation. Don't get the illusion that he was up on the top of a mountain somewhere.
And he was actually a staff.
Tower. Well, essentially, yes. I mean, the tower, which gives you perhaps a picture of some tower standing alone on a hill, is actually just part of it's built into the wall around his estate. So he's not very far away from all of the busyness that's going on around him.
His wife had
it's
a
quite
wing.
Noisy.
And all of that.
But nonetheless, it may not be as solitary as a Buddhist retreat, for example, but nonetheless, he committed himself to just spending his days alone in this place and reading a lot and basically using writing as basically a tool whereby to explore what it meant to be him. In other words, he's probably one of the very first writers in the Western tradition who takes self-consciousness very seriously and actually tries to be totally and utterly honest. He doesn't hide anything. He just takes the reader where his mind happens to be going at that time. So for us who are used to these rather confessional autobiographies and so on, it's not so unusual, but at the time it was pretty unprecedented actually. And the Greeks and the Romans, when they wrote, they didn't write in this intensely personal way. They were much more detached, as it were. If you read Seneca's letters or stuff like it's much more distanced. Montaigne, you're really burrowing into the
individual
messiness of his life as he's writing. So it's incredibly revelatory. And I think what he has to say about solitude, and he says a great deal about, is very, very revealing. Solitude is really a place where you come to dwell in a kind of inner contentment. It has to do with learning how to stabilize your attention, although he may not use quite that language, which sounds like Buddhist meditation. But the ways, what I've done in the book, The Art of Solitude, is I've read through the whole of Montaigne's essays, and I highlighted and selected from them the passages that to me had the greatest Buddhist resonance, even though Montaigne knew nothing about Buddhism at all. There was no information available in 16th century Europe about Buddhism. But what's really remarkable from my Buddhist perspective is how insightful he was in understanding what we would now call the practice of mindfulness, the practice of self-awareness. And he kind of figured it out for himself, actually. And so I think he's a very good example of someone from the Western tradition who is drawn to a certain kind of practical philosophy, who puts it into practice in his own life and ends up doing something that is immediately recognizable to anyone who's practiced Buddhist meditation. So he's a wonderful figure who joins together so many different threads in our world.
Yeah, and I read your more recent work, and I think it's right. It's Buddha and Socrates, or Buddha and Plato, who were contemporaries, but on different different parts of the world at the same time. So similar ideas, but not necessarily interfaced in the way they would be today.
That's right. Yeah.
And
absolutely,
I guess part of the question here too is from your perspective. You mentioned sort of Montaigne's methodology, right, of sort of trapping himself into this tower, albeit with lots of busyness and, someone lighting his fireplace every day and things like that going on. But in terms of the modern methodology of doing that, I mean, some might point to social media, right, as a way of like your self-confessional, but a lot of it is very performative. And
Yeah.
it fulfills sort of an external need rather than an internal desire in some cases, or some sort of internal fulfillment. So in terms of achieving, and this is just a thought exercise, but in terms of achieving that solitude, what does the modern methodology look like from your perspective, and how does that play out given we're so interconnected in general?
Well, before I answer that, which I will,
Okay.
Montaigne was also Montaigne. If you look at Montaigne's work and look at his life, his solitude was also somewhat performative. In
Hmm.
other words, he was very keen to publish his essays.
Mm.
It's not as though essays were just a sort of a personal diary that he kept for his own edification. Oh, no, 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 no. Once he got to a certain number, then he made a big effort to publish, and he kept on publishing too. So
Yeah, the tome.
he was writing these things not just for himself, he was communicating. And so there you get again this unavoidable tension between a deeply solitary activity, writing about his own mind, and yet writing is necessarily a social activity. Even if he had no intention to publish this stuff, and then he suddenly dropped dead, the writing would still be there. It would probably still be in the world somewhere. So in other words, as soon as you write, you're communicating and you're presupposing the existence of another. He also says in one passage in the essays that he says that if there were not anyone else with whom I could share what I've learned from solitude, then solitude would have much less value for me. So in other words, in order to fully appreciate solitude, you need to be able to share it, paradoxically, with someone else. So you can never really, there's no such thing as absolute solitude, or perhaps there's
Yeah.
death. I don't.
Yeah, but even in the oral tradition, eventually you come out of solitude, and if you don't have the writings
You
persist, you have
can't
the
help.
story told.
And also you have your mind. Your mind is you're thinking. And you're
Hmm.
not, and the language in which you're thinking is not your private language. It's the language of your culture, your peers, your society. And so you're always, even when you're thinking and writing, there's always an implied listener to what you're thinking or what you're writing down, and so on.
When I was writing some of the guide, and this is getting now to Martin, but I'll come back to Montaigne in a second. But the idea that the perfectionism or the standards of a society don't leave you, even though you're physically isolated, and the
Yeah,
fact that her work, she right produced a lot of it in isolation, but it was always meant to be presented to an audience, to a public. And it's very hard to disentangle where, one person ends, you begin, and the next person begins, because even if you retreat, you're carrying the conceptual baggage of other people with you.
exactly. So going back to your question
Yeah.
about what would contemporary methodology, given or our social media, our current lifestyle, how would that, how would we do solitude in the kind of world we live now? Well, we have things today that Montaigne certainly did not have. In other words, we have meditation centers. For example, you can go off for a week and people will take care of you and tell you how to meditate. There's things. So there are facilities, and maybe Montaigne was privileged. He was an aristocrat. Nowadays, we have a lifestyle, a working life, which has periods in which we work. We have weekends off. We have 2 or 3 weeks or 5 weeks or 6 weeks holidays. We have periods in our life, like when we're at college or after we leave our work or whenever, where we can actually quite easily create places and times in which we can devote ourselves to solitude. Right. So I think we have in the modern world enormous possibilities that Montaigne and other ancients didn't have. I mean, we have greater leisure time, we have facilities like retreat centers and so on and so forth. So yeah, we can do all of that stuff. But as I was already been saying, just to put yourself into a physically isolated place does not mean that you're going to experience true solitude, as Montaigne calls it. In other words, solitude is not something you just automatically get as soon as you go away to somewhere remote. You don't. In fact, as many people will find out, you go up to the top of the mountain and you're absolutely, you're confused, you're bored, you're lonely, all of this stuff. And you have no real you have no inner skills, as it were, to, in a way, work with all of that. It's just a miserable experience. So as the contemplative traditions, the Christians and the Buddhists and others have found out, solitude is something you have to work at. Solitude is something you have to cultivate, something you have to refine, something you have to learn to tolerate also. And so it's a discipline, I feel. And that's what, in fact, happens when you go on a week-long retreat and you haven't done it before. It's actually quite hard work, and we don't have those skills. So I feel that as much as I feel it's important that people learn to get a more balanced existence between their inner life, let's say, and their outer life, in practice, the inner life is one that we're not all terribly well equipped to do. And I don't think the way our society is going, less and less attention on the arts, for example, in education, diminishing attendance in religious communities, spiritual communities. We have, in some ways, we're moving further and further away from the art of solitude and cultivating the art of solitude. And we're getting ourselves sucked into this incredibly discursive and busy, interactive, internet-based media that is so prevalent in what we're doing now. We're talking via this incredible technology that we wouldn't have had 15 years ago, 10 years ago.
We're still physically alone in a lot of those cases, right?
Yeah, physically alone. And so I think the jury, I think the jury's out as to whether this is a good time for solitude or not. There are things pulling us away from it, but also I think those very forces that, do result in our feeling more and more lonely, cut off, alienated, isolated, could perhaps be the very thing that we need to prompt a reassessment of how a human life can be deeply meaningful and fulfilling, even though you're basically on your own. And I think particularly we see this in the artists, particularly, who very often are alone in their studios.
Maybe that's a good transition point, because the next topic I wanted to talk about was I really got engrossed in the pieces around Vermeer and Martin in particular. I guess at a high level, they're very different, right? In terms of the art they produced, the period of time, the subject matter. But at the same time, there is a strong connection to exploring emotion, right? It's harder to see in Martin's work, obviously, because it's more minimalist and abstract. But, even seeing the paintings physically, which I had an opportunity to do last week, it's striking in how you move closer and further away in terms of your perspective and seeing grid lines versus not. But then also just looking at the titles, right? And how some of them have to do very much with innocence or childhood versus some more, I think we call them developed emotions or more complex emotions in other works. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about your choice to include both of those artists in the book and how they tie back to sort of the main message in The Art of Solitude.
Well, I think I started really by wanting to explore Vermeer. I've always been very fond of Vermeer. And what has always struck me about him is how in so many of his paintings, it's just one person in a room, and it's usually a woman. There's only two of his paintings that actually feature a male figure alone. Solitary images are all of women. And I found that amongst all of the artists, certainly of that period, 17th century in Holland, Vermeer somehow captured, and I don't know how he did it, he somehow captures the introspective quality of a young woman reading a letter. In a way that, to me, it's a miracle how he does it, how somehow, just with a few brushstrokes, he's able to evoke the sense of a person absorbed in her own thoughts and her own feelings. It's absolutely magical. And what it really shows us is, in a sense, a picture of our own solitariness, that we spend too a lot of our time, reading books, reading letters, reading emails, maybe listening to a piece of music. And if we were to be photographed or painted by Vermeer, hopefully, doing that activity, it would again give us a glimpse into this human quality of aloneness. And I find it's a very spiritual quality too. And although the settings of Vermeer's portraits of single women in rooms is very much a rather slightly luxurious bourgeois kind of living room, as it were. What he manages to do is to put the totality of his attention on letting that room evoke the person's solitude. So you can't have. I find the Vermeer paintings, like the girl with the pearl earring, the famous one, is
Yeah.
just it's called a trony. It's just a headshot.
Hmm.
And there's no context. It's just black in the background. The
Yeah.
painting, and that doesn't, to me, communicate solitude. It's the most solitary paintings are the ones in which the subject, usually a woman, is in a room surrounded by all kinds of stuff. It's a
Yeah.
busy, prosperous, bourgeois existence, and yet he captures them at moments in which they are profoundly alone with themselves, with their thoughts and their feelings. And that, to me, is an illustration of solitude that I've not really found in other artists, certainly of that period.
Yeah, it's funny. It's also solitude almost as a luxury to some extent at that time, anyway. Having the
Yes,
time to read the letter, write the letter. Weigh. And there's some with weighing jewelry or other precious
that's right. Yeah.
artifacts. There's a funny one with well, I think it's funny, where the woman's taking a nap ostensibly
Yeah.
near the table, and that one I think speaks to some modern tiredness as well.
No, that's true. I think it's a portrait of a maid
Yeah,
off duty, I think,
yeah,
is the
yeah.
one.
Sort of in the kitchen area. That would have been, yeah.
But the problem with Vermeer is we know absolutely nothing whatsoever about him.
Hmm.
We have no record of anything he wrote, anything he said. All we have are like 37 small paintings. Some of them are a bit bigger. But when we get to the reason I chose Agnes Martin, who's a
Hmm.
contemporary, well, she's no longer alive, but is a 20th century abstract painter, lived a lot of her life in New Mexico, and also had serious mental health issues, which she didn't, shy away from. They were, that were part of who she was. But what the difference is that Martin actually talks about solitude. I mean, she makes it into a very central concept in the work that she does. And so in that sense, I'm able to get into a very different artistic perspective, focusing more on the painter rather than the work itself. And also, I'm able to contrast the two as a man and a woman. I didn't want to have two blokes, two men. I thought it was very important to have a woman figure. Montaigne paints women, but of course he does so with a male gaze.
Hmm.
I mean, he's a man looking at a woman, and all of his interests are somehow tacitly encoded in what he's seeing. With
Hmm.
Agnes, you have a woman who's basically a natural kind of mystic. She would enter into these states of mystical type contemplation, and in that silence, in that solitude, there would emerge a tiny little postage stamp size version of an image, which she would then scale up and paint. And so you see in her work, and her writing is somewhat fragmentary. It's not written in a very sort of clear prose, but
Yeah,
you can get very good sense from her notes of how important her art was to her experience of solitude, and how important her experience of solitude was in the production of her art. So in New Mexico, for example, she literally lived out on a mesa,
yeah.
a small town.
She built herself.
Yeah,
It's kind of incredible. I've
herself.
read some of
Yeah,
her
it's
biography,
amazing. It's quite
um,
amazing.
and some of her talks to students as well, just talking about. Well, asceticism also becomes a part of the conversation, but um, just thinking about how she kind of left it all behind. One of the things I came to as well is, and I'm glad you pointed this out also, is right. There's a different perspective when it's a person who's a minority in the art world, right? A woman, someone who's suffering from, who's queer, who's suffering from, mental health issues that were many times just glossed over. It's almost like a
Uh-huh.
solitude also becomes a form of protection
Yeah.
from that world, which is something that I've thought about a lot, and sort of what compels someone, right, to want to be in solitude. I think a lot of it really was the artwork, just based on some of the things that I've read. But it is very interesting that there's the two very different kind of artistic figures, and Martin is at a much different end or much different pole than Vermeer.
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely.
So then, in terms of, and maybe I'll move on to the next piece around shamanism and thinking about plant medicine, and also just um, non-Western ways of thinking about solitude and how those, come to be integrated, I think, to, Western perspective. Because I think more and more there are sort of, I don't want to call it DIY, but less, well supported or time substantiated ways of sort of connecting with solitude. And it's becoming a bit more, as you read in the book, right, a bit more accepted to either, practice from a religious perspective, either with or without substances. And we have to be careful about substance as well because of all the dangers and risks involved, but just doing things a little bit differently than we used to do them. And so what your perspective and experience has been, sort of embracing some things that are different from the Western standard.
Well, that's true. I mean, my whole life, in a sense,
Yeah.
because of my involvement in Buddhism, has led me into non-Western forms of thinking, non-Western forms of religious belief and practice. And yeah, but at the same time, I'm a Westerner, and I'm never going to not be a Westerner. And so I'm receiving and interpreting and digesting all of these non-Western ideas in a Western mind, in a Western body. And what I then give out in my writings and the talks and so on I give are also largely to other Western people like myself. I also feel, though, that in some ways the Western norm is becoming globalized in terms of how, let's say, worldwide now, the system of education is largely the same. In other words, in order for our consumerist economy and capitalism to operate, we need to be educated on the same subject so we can operate within the global economy and so on. And I think that process of globalization is not just about trade, but it's actually about winnowing down of differences, cultural and religious and other differences. And again, with the internet and all of these things, there's a kind of a danger that the whole world is smothered in a culture of rather superficial sameness. And so I do think there is a great importance in not losing touch with the traditions that do not play into that paradigm. And let's say Tibetan Buddhism, for example, or Amazonian shamanism as two very clear examples. Perhaps more so than the Buddhist cultures, though, I feel that the indigenous cultures that we find certainly in Mexico, in South America, or even in North America too, with the Native Americans, and to some extent also in Africa and no doubt in Australia and elsewhere, where indigenous societies still survive, is that we tap down into a deeper layer of human experience historically, that is still alive. There's a living tradition. I mean, there are, as you know, there are tribes in the Amazon that have not actually had any contact with the outside world, even today in 2025, which is quite amazing, really. And so I was very drawn when I turned 60 and embarked on this project of solitude to revisit my experiences I'd had as a teenager with psychedelics like LSD under extremely inappropriate conditions in most. And to actually go back to these shamans in Mexico and elsewhere and actually try to understand, where they're coming from. Perhaps because of their much more deeper embeddedness in the natural world and their recognition that the reality is not just about atoms and molecules and evolution and so forth and so on, but it's also about spirits and non-human entities and forces and things that you and I might write off as a bit superstitious. But these are still living realities for these people. And I think we have a great debt to them, not just as individuals in their own right, but also as a recognition of the debt we have to our ancestors who lay at the origins of our own culture as well. There's a lot of evidence that in the ancient Greeks, when they conducted their religious ceremonies, which we know very little about, the mystery religions, it's fairly much accepted that this probably involved the use of psychotropic agents. We don't know which ones, but we find that likewise in India too, and in other traditional societies, that often in religious settings, certain substances would be eaten or drunk, smoked, whatever, and these would put you into an altered state of mind. Now, the ceremonies that I participated in were primarily with ayahuasca. And ayahuasca, the active agent is DMT, which is quite a potent psychotropic hallucinogen. And when these are taken in ceremonial settings, they're done in silence. It's not a rock and roll concert.
A rave.
Silence. And it's done usually in a group. It's although paradoxically, although I'm writing of it as a solitary activity, it actually is a communal activity. You do it in your with others, but you do so in a way in which you're not really communicating with the others. You're actually you're being held by the group and held by the shaman to allow the effects of this medicine to take over. And with ayahuasca, this lasts about 5 hours or so. What happens is that a certain amount of your habitual mental chatter and your anxieties and worries and so on kind of fade away, and you come to rest in a very still, very open, and I think very attentive, mindful state of consciousness that's somehow not really the same as our everyday, how we get about in the world type consciousness. So it offers a kind of a portal, an opportunity to come to rest in a deep stillness in such a way that one can begin to reconnect with the very roots of one's experience as a human being. It's difficult to describe these things. It's possibly impossible to describe these things. And also, I don't believe at all either that you just take the pill and you'll get the effect. It has very much to do with the context within which these medicines are taken. It has to do with what they technically call the setting and the set. It has to do with your intentions. It has to do with the support environment, the symbolism, music, whatever it might be, that supports. It has to do with the presence of other people. But I found these were very powerful experiences, and they somehow allowed me to get in touch with something very core to what I consider to be my humanity, my consciousness, one might even say. Prior to that, there's something curiously purgative and cleansing about the experience. That is what I found, in a sense, slightly surprising, was that it's as though you've somehow allowed yourself an opportunity to just rid yourself of certain habits, certain tensions, perhaps certain frustrations, certain difficult traumatic memories. They tend to sort of feel as though they're given permission to leave. And I felt at the end of all of these ceremonies a great sense of purity on the one hand, and on the other hand, a very strong sense of confirmation. That's the only word I can use, really.
It sounds like it would impact your perception of solitude almost permanently, or what's possible within solitude, sort of that way. At least is my reading of it.
Well, I'm hesitant to use the word permanently.
Okay. No, understood.
Of these medicines did last far longer than the time they were actually active. I mean, for several weeks after these experiences, I could still feel in my body the impact that these medicines had had. But after a month or two, I think that pretty much fades away. But it is a period, it is an experience in which you can take stock of yourself from a very different perspective. And I found that enormously valuable. It's not something I've done since. And that was the last one I participated in, was about 7 years ago. Though I may revisit that again, but I'd like to do so actually by going out to Peru or somewhere.
Or different.
Getting more involved in their culture of the indigenous peoples, as well as exploring the potentials of ayahuasca.
Okay, so maybe this has all been super helpful and given me a lot of perspective on the book and the writing. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think is important as someone dives into your work in the Art of Solitude, or any other of your writing that we haven't mentioned?
Well, there's quite a lot,
but anything top of mind.
The one thing we haven't, we've covered 3 of the threads in the book. We've covered art, we've covered medicines, we've covered Montaigne, philosophy. We haven't actually talked about meditation. And meditation is probably the connective tissue that holds all of this together. And that's also, of course, in a sense, where I was coming from writing this book, is the experiences I had I have continue to have as a Buddhist practitioner, who's someone who meditates on a regular basis, so goes on retreats and all of these things. Meditation's been an extremely important part of my life, and that to me is really where I get my daily fix of solitude. And that doesn't, and I'm using that, slightly jokingly, but
Cheekily.
actually cheekily, yes, to take half an hour a day, which I do, and just to sit still in silence, just observing your breath or a mantra, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. But that is essentially cutting the world off for 30 minutes and just attending to how you are in that period of time. And it's to do so with a completely non-judgmental, non-critical attitude, just to be able to say, yes, this is who I am. This is what it feels like to be me. This is me on a cushion with a painful knee at the moment. This is my mind throwing up this anxiety I've got about the talk I have to give tomorrow night. But without getting normally we just follow those thoughts.
Yeah.
And let them carry us away, and we just sort of drift. But in meditation, you consciously decide that you're not going to do it.
You're
That if a thought
noting.
arises,
Yeah.
you just pay attention to it. It might carry you off, but it may not. And if it does, you just come back. And if you do this practice, comparable sort of practice on a daily basis, you begin to actually open up something that's not just an idea, but actually a felt feeling in your body
Mm-hmm.
of a kind of stillness and clarity, which is very much your aloneness, because nobody else is experiencing that except you, and is a kind of a ground from which to then go through your life. And there, I think we have a tool, a methodology, whereby we can learn to integrate our practice of solitude with our practice of living in the world, participating, engaging with the issues of life, our work, our art, whatever else it might be. And so I feel that that would perhaps be the point we should perhaps end on, is the centrality of what I call meditation. Other people might call it prayer, or yoga or something. It doesn't really matter. But to have that regular daily discipline of connecting to your essential solitude as a human person, your essential moment between your birth and your death, is for me a very important daily.
Yeah, and it seems to me it doesn't have to be fancy or, you don't have to go up into a tower as long as you're deliberate.
You don't need to go up into a tower. You can do it in a corner of the bedroom. It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Yeah, you'll find a lot of excuses to not meditate. Like, I don't have the time. I don't have a nice little place.
Mhm.
It's too noisy. But you actually have to learn to meditate wherever you happen to be, whatever's going on. Meditation should be a quality that you aspire to bring more and more into your conscious life, so that your consciousness becomes more and more infused with a kind of contemplative presence. And so it's not just something you enjoy when you're formally meditating, but it's something that becomes more and more part of how you operate in the world itself.
Perfect. Well, that's a great place to end our conversation. So I just want to thank you for the time today. And that's the first episode of Philosophique. We will return in January with a study of bell hooks, several authors who've written about her work, and an exploration of love and what it means for all of us. So thank you for joining me on this first episode. You can find the reading guide at getphilosophique.com or on Instagram at getphilosophique or on Substack at getphilosophique. Thank you for your time.